interrupt this program to bring you Courage, the Cowardly Dog Month.
Whole month of Courage, the Cowardly Dog. First appearing in 1996, it was picked up by Cartoon Network, who work in the middle of Burbank, and directed by cartoonist John Dilworth. Though many years have passed since the original air date, it's now time for Zack to celebrate this great show.
Well, old sport, what do you think? Neat.
Hey guys, Zack here, and welcome back to Courage Month. So, in this episode that we're going to be reviewing, we're actually going to be discussing both parts A and part B of episode 2. So, yeah, without much further ado, let's just get into it and start reviewing this episode, shall we? Okay, so this first part of the episode is called the Shadow of Courage, which is, as you can expect, is actually interesting because it is like the first antagonist technically shown in the entire series. It's shown in the intro bumper for the series. It's shown in the opening intro for the series. So the antagonist from this episode kind of important to the overall series in general, but the episode actually opens off with an old miser living in his house, contemplating about whether or not he can buy the moon. And his butler tells him no, since some things are just not for sale. But the miser merely responds that anything can be bought, even people. And then after 50 years with him, the butler should know that by now. And then for disagreeing with him, the miser fires his butler, who walks out of the house kind of dejected looking. But then the old miser suffers a heart attack, and his shadow suddenly comes to life and is set free. And at which point it then proceeds to start playing pranks on the people of Nowhere, Kansas, which is the town where the Cowardly Dog cartoon is set. So I haven't talked about this yet, but it's come up. Nowhere. It's actually kind of a double meaning about where Muriel and Eustace live. They live in the middle of nowhere, which is both a reference to the fact that they live geologically in a place where there is absolutely nothing, and they also live in the center of their town, which is kind of a funny little double meaning. But in any case, while the shadow is actually playing pranks on the people of Nowhere, it actually sees lightning and it panics a little bit and goes to looking for somewhere to hide. Meanwhile, Courage, who is currently sleeping on Muriel and Eustace's bed, he hears the lightning as well and kind of wakes up and panics. And Eustace is a little annoyed that Courage woke him up with his antics, so he kicks him off the bed. So Courage recollects himself and winds up looking out the window to try and calm himself down. And as he's looking out the window, he actually spies the shadow, and believing it to be a burglar, he lets Muriel and Eustace know what's going on, and tells them that there's somebody in the house. So Muriel and Eustace both grab a weapon and go down into the main living room area, but are a little confused as to when there's actually nobody there. And though Courage insists that he saw somebody come into the house, but Eustace is just having none of it and tells Courage that he has to go sleep in the attic if he's not going to behave. And then proceeds to bring him to the attic, which Muriel questions is whether or not that's fair, but Eustace merely lies to her and said that he seemed happy. But when in actuality, he's miserable and shivering. But Courage is very adamant on the fact that he saw something and is curious as to what exactly is going on and what it is he really saw, and even plays through a couple of different scenarios in his head about what could happen to Muriel and Eustace if he doesn't actually determine whether or not there's a burglar. And as he's doing all of that, the shadow actually decides to shapeshift into a monster and scare Courage. And Courage immediately bolts out of the attic, actually breaking the door in the process, and tells Muriel and Eustace what he just saw. So they once again grab a weapon and follow him to the attic, and Eustace is annoyed that Courage broke the attic door, but Courage tells him to forget about the door and pointing out that there's a monster in the attic and that's far more important. So they then proceed to go into the attic, but there's nobody, but there's nothing in there, and Courage begins to wonder if he's actually crazy or not. So Muriel goes back to bed, hoping that Courage isn't going to be doing this all night. While Eustace kind of tells him that that he'll be forced to sleep with the termites if Courage doesn't actually behave himself and start behaving like a proper dog, and also stops waking Eustace up in the middle of the night, because it's starting to get annoying. And for good reason. Obviously, Eustace is kind of justified in this situation. He's usually very antagonistic to Courage, and that's kind of one of his main character traits. But here it's completely justified because Courage keeps waking him up over what is presumably nothing. So yeah, Eustace does kind of have a bit of a justified reason to be mean to Courage here. But as Eustace is actually giving Courage a stern talking to, Muriel wonders what's actually keeping him from coming back to bed. At which point the Shadow decides to shapeshift into an image of Eustace strangling Courage, which causes Muriel to just spring into action. She grabs a rolling pin from under her bed, and then then proceeds to beat Eustace over the head with it, and bring Courage back to her bed, saying that now Eustace can be the one to sleep in the attic. And Eustace is just there wondering what the hell he did. So, and for good reason, because he didn't do anything. He didn't even touch Courage. He's kind of scared him a little bit, but he didn't do anything to Courage. The Shadow did all of the work and made it look like it was Eustace who did it. But as Eustace is grumbling about the fact that he has to actually sleep in the attic, the Shadow decides to once again torment Eustace by shapeshifting into a shadowy image of Courage, and proceeds to mock Eustace. And Eustace is kind of upset with it, mainly because it looks like Courage, and Courage has been nothing but a problem this entire night. So he then proceeds to get into a slapping fight with the Shadow, and the Shadow bites him, which then causes Eustace to fly into a rage and want to actually strangle Courage for something Courage didn't even do. And the Shadow then proceeds to lead him back into the main bedroom, where he tries to strangle Courage, and Courage realizes that he's in serious danger, so he flees and hides under the sink. But the Shadow is actually very much one step ahead of him and actually shapeshifts into a snake, while hiding in the shadow of the piping underneath the sink, which scares Courage, causing him to cling to Eustace for safety. But it becomes apparent that that was actually a mistake, because Courage actually realizes he's about to be strangled. And Eustace then proceeds to strangle him, and then actually gets beat over the head by Muriel for something he actually did this time. With Eustace contemplating what exactly he did wrong. And then the Shadow decides to scare Eustace and shapeshifts into a monster. At which point, Muriel and Courage are about to settle back into bed again, but then they hear Eustace scream, and Muriel gets up to go and see what's wrong, but Courage merely reassures her that he'll go do it, even though he points out that he has to be crazy to do it, and goes to check on Eustace, only for Eustace's hat to be there, and Eustace is nowhere to be found. At which point, Courage immediately assumes that the Shadow ate him, and fearing the worst for Muriel, proceeds to run up to the attic to try and figure out a way to actually deal with the Shadow. And in actuality, Eustace just hid in the fridge and was completely fine. Then he wonders if he himself is actually losing his mind. But then contemplates that no, he's not losing his mind, he's just losing his hat, and then proceeds to pick it up, only for the Shadow to actually shapeshift into yet another monster, and Eustace goes running, and is later revealed to be hiding in his truck. He later hides in his truck, and he stays there for the rest of the episode. But in any case, Courage then proceeds to go onto the Bagge Family computer, which is a recurring character. I'm going to picture it because, technically speaking, while it isn't a character itself, it apparently has an artificial intelligence, which, for whatever reason, again, don't think that's ever explained either. But it does have a kind of a sarcastic wit about it, and when Courage kind of asks it about how it can actually deal with the Shadow and what it is, the computer kind of sarcastically remarks that if he tries to have a plans a conversation with it, or that can actually work, or B, can move out of the house. But Courage is annoyed, pointing out that doesn't seem like much of a solution, since how is he supposed to talk to a shadow? But and the computer doesn't really give him a hard answer. It just tells him to go figure it out. At which point, Courage goes down to go find the shadow, and notices Muriel is missing, so he immediately panics and assumes the worst, and believing the shadow to have taken her, he then proceeds to head into the basement with a flashlight, although he's initially very scared to go in and makes a big play about how he's going to actually go in, and flashes the flashlight around to see if the shadow's down there, and it roars at him like a dragon. And Courage actually panics and slams the door, but then decides to man up and go look for Muriel down in the basement. Pointing out that he really should contemplate his life choices, since as he points out, the things he does for love. So he goes into the basement to go look for the shadow, and he does eventually find the shadow, which shapeshifts into a bunch of scenes as Courage keeps turning the flashlight on and off. And keeps shapeshifting into a bunch of scenes where Muriel is being tortured. But then it stops being images of Muriel being tortured and just random images in general. As the shadow tries to keep up with Courage's flashlight, and eventually the shadow tells him to knock it off, since it can't keep doing the whole on and off thing. At which point Courage decides to finally ask the shadow where Muriel is. And the shadow just responds that he isn't exactly her keeper, and then they hear a toilet flush, and it's revealed that she's been in the bathroom the whole time and wasn't never in any real danger. So the shadow even points that out. But then Courage wonders why the shadow is actually running around scaring everybody, since obviously the shadow has kept them up most of the night. So the shadow then proceeds to tell him its life story about how he was bound to an elderly miser who wasn't a very nice dude. And then proceeds to explain that he didn't want to be the shadow of an elderly miser. That wasn't who he wanted to be. He always wanted to be the shadow of a star and go into showbiz. And Courage doesn't really know if he can actually figure out a way to do that, but he does point out that he does have a possibly alternative solution, and takes the shadow outside to show him the starry skies at night, and points out that he could, in theory, become the shadow of an actual star rather than a Broadway star or whatever. And the shadow points out that may be a bit wishy-washy and a little bit happy-feely for him, but he points out that he'll give it a try. And then shakes Courage's hand and thanks him for everything. At which point Courage just decides to ask him where Eustace actually went, and the shadow merely points him in the direction of the truck and states that he may be even more of a coward than Courage is. But in any case, after parting on friendly terms, the shadow then proceeds to go and bind itself to a shadow and bind itself to a star and become the star's shadow, and he points out that it's not half bad. But in case with the shadow dealt with, everybody proceeds to go to bed with Eustace and Courage that sleeping on the bed and side by side. But then they see another creepy shadow in the other peripheral vision and see a giant shadow looming in the doorway to the bedroom. And at which point both Courage and Eustace proceed to panic, but as it turns out, it's just Muriel, and that she was just had her put her air curlers in so that she could go to bed. With Courage merely responding that that's actually pretty creepy. So that's where the first half of the episode ends. So it's kind of interesting. So yeah, this episode just kind of sets up the idea that not all of the antagonists are going to be bad guys. Not all of them. Some of them are just there to pull pranks or whatever, and some of them can be redeemed. But this episode is kind of interesting because it just sets up the idea of just these supernatural creatures that will just show up. And just torment the family, and not all of them are going to be evil, but some of them are going. But there are definitely going to be some supernatural creatures that are going to show up at some point or another and just terrorize the family. But in any case, that's the first half of this episode done. On to the next review. Okay, so in the second half of this episode, we're actually introduced to Quack, who is another recurring antagonist. He also shows up every season like Cats, but unlike Cats, he's not sadistic, but he's just a con artist. But in any case, it starts off with Eustace actually trying to repair a hole in the roof. And he's actually working on it. And as he's working on it, Muriel actually calls on him, pointing out that he needs to keep the racket down since he'll bother the neighbors, which is a very obvious joke about the fact that they have no neighbors. And Eustace even admits that in the episode himself. But as he's hammering away at the roof, one of the planks actually comes loose and it hits Muriel on the head. And Eustace eventually realizes what happened and brings her into the house to actually kind of help her recover and recuperate. But it quickly becomes apparent that Muriel has amnesia. She doesn't remember the inside of her own house. She doesn't remember Eustace or herself. She doesn't remember them getting married. And more to the point, and much to Eustace's glee, she doesn't remember who Courage is or where he came from. So Eustace takes this opportunity to finally kick Courage out of the house, much to Courage's chagrin. But Courage manages to sneak into the attic by launching himself. He actually breaks in through the window. And proceeds to climb onto the computer to actually get some help. And puts an inquiry into the computer, telling it that it doesn't remember who he is, or that Muriel doesn't remember who she is or who Courage is, and that he needs help. At which point the computer, after kind of taking pity on Courage, decides to actually get him in contact with an amnesia specialist. And said amnesia specialist turns out to be Quack, who, as we've established, is a con artist who likes to rob people blind. After getting the email, Quack then puts on a fake mustache and proceeds to disguise himself as an amnesia specialist and goes to the Bagge farm. At which point Courage watches the whole thing unfold, and Quack knocks on the door and asks to see the patient, giving Eustace his credentials. And Eustace points out that he doesn't know what Quack was talking about, but so Quack then proceeds to knock Eustace out with a giant mallet and drag him into the living room closet. At which point Courage realizes just exactly what he's done. And realizing too late that he's actually put Muriel in danger by calling Quack in the first place. He then proceeds to try and trick Quack into actually giving up Muriel, and even tells Muriel that she needs to leave. But Muriel, who doesn't really recognize who Courage is still, so he tries to pull on her arm in vain, and Quack then proceeds to chase Courage out of the house, and Courage hides above the door so Quack doesn't see him. And at which point Quack then proceeds to go back in the room, and realizing Muriel is likely the patient, he then proceeds to take off his disguise and decides to help her remember by conducting a bunch of quote-unquote therapeutic exercises that are really just a way for him to actually get information out of Muriel about where all of their valuables are, by trying to find the silverware. But when that proves to not be successful, he then ties her up and begins tickling her feet to actually get her to talk. At which point Courage barges back in the house to try and save her, while Quack is distracted. During the episode, Quack notices that Courage is trying to interrupt, so he chases him out of the house again. And this time Courage actually pretends to be a rug, with Quack not noticing that he's actually standing on Courage, and proceeds to go back inside and continue torturing Muriel. This time using a runaway using a train that he's rigged to smash pies in her face while she's tied up in the chair, and she's kind of understandably panicking. So Courage realizes he needs to actually save her from this, and that he actually hasn't done such a very good job of it yet. So he then proceeds to take wires from the TV and wires them into Quack's train track, which causes the train to explode while Quack is in front of it. At which point Quack gets annoyed at Courage yet again and chases after him. But in any case, Quack then proceeds to chase Courage out of the house yet again. And proceeds to chase him out of the house, which again Courage manages to hide again. And Quack realizes Courage is quite the Houdini and will need to prepare prepared next time he comes back. At which point Courage proceeds to pole vault into the attic and tries to call the police for help. He shoots an email to the police, who then respond immediately asking him where he is, and Courage responds that he's at the bog farm in the middle of nowhere, and they ask him what he's supposed to do, and he tells them to send help. At which point he hears Muriel scream, and after sending the email, he then proceeds to go and check on her. And at this point, Quack has started torturing her with stinky cheese, which Courage realizes is very bad for her because now he's just kind of messing with her olfactory senses and all that. It's just kind of like psychological torture at this point. But in any case, Courage yells at Quack to leave her alone, and he then proceeds to run out of the living room and slams the door in Quack's face. And when Quack opens it, he's greeted by a large rat, and that Courage actually refers to as Mr. Mouse. And despite his intimidating appearance and scary looking visage, he and Courage are apparently old friends because Mr. Mouse then proceeds to help Courage out by not only beating Quack in the head, but also eating the stinky cheese that Quack was using to torture Muriel. And then after paying Mr. Mouse, Mr. Mouse then proceeds to go on his merry way. So yeah, he's established to be an old friend of Courage. In any case, Quack then recovers and proceeds to go and chase Courage out of the house again. But this time, Quack's prepared because he's actually bolted the back door shut so Courage can't run out of it again. And then proceeds to pull out a vacuum, claiming that he now has Courage and there's nowhere for him to run. And then proceeds to vacuum up everything in the immediate vicinity, including some of Courage's fur, which winds up clogging the vacuum and it explodes. At which point the police actually barge in and arrest Quack, since they've been looking for him for a very long time, and Courage finally was able to give them a lead and actually help them arrest him. And with Courage merely remarking what took so long. But in any case, in the process, while the police are actually dealing with Quack, Courage goes to check up on Muriel and freeze her. And in the process, several of the traumas that Quack has inflicted on Muriel had actually caused her to recover and actually regain her memories. But then she proceeds to wonder where Eustace is. And at which point Courage remembers that Eustace is actually in the closet and goes to check on him, only to discover that Eustace is actually completely forgotten who he is. And Courage just decides to leave him that way for a bit until he kind of learns his lesson. This episode actually ends on the bad guy winning, kind of, sort of, because while he is ultimately arrested at the end of the episode, an end of the episode scene shows that Quack actually breaks free from police custody, disguises himself as a police officer, and escapes, and then tells the audience that they haven't seen the last of him. So yeah, this episode ends, just kind of sets up Quack as another secondary antagonist, because, well, unlike Cats, who's sadistic and wants to kill people, Quack just wants to rob them blind, which is better. Not necessarily like he's like this evil dude, but he's more like he wants to rob people of the possessions. That is his entire thing. He's not sadistic like Cats is. He just wants to rob people of their possessions, and whereas Cats just wants to kill everybody dead. So yeah, but in any case, that is my review of both Shadow of Courage and Quack Amnesia Specialist. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Also be sure to check out my Discord server, link down in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with the channel, and that is actually the best way to do that. Also, be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well if you want to help support the future projects like this massive one that I'm doing for October. It's only a couple bucks a month. It does help me out, so if you guys want to go check that out, link is down in the description as well. And finally, if you want to see more content from me, there's actually two ways you can do that. One is by checking out my Twitch, so that you actually see some of the live streams that we're going to be doing this month as well. We're going to be streaming a bunch of horror games. I'm not entirely sure if I'll keep my same time, because I have a couple of them. I have a couple of things that I'm going to be doing over the weekend, so I may move some things around as needed. But there will be a live stream every Sunday. Don't worry about that. And finally, if you want to see even more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top one is the most recent one. It may or may not be this one, and it may or may not be Courage related. whereas the bottom video is a video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. And again, it may or may not be courage related. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!